Today's question on this Sunday, since we have clearly nothing else to do, is supposedly a survey being circulated by Blizzard around the possible changes they could do to Mythic Plus, and one of the questions asked to the player is: how interested would you be in Mythic Plus dungeons utilizing a death limit, something like we already see, for example, in Delves, instead of a timer? Now, I'm sure that throughout your life around this game, you might have heard this type of question once or twice. This kind of idea of Mythic Plus being fundamentally evil or flawed because there is a timer attached to it. So, a lot of the strategies, a lot of the meta, and a lot of the general play styles that happen in Mythic Plus are practically affected by the fact that there is a timer, by the fact that you can't just play it like you are in vanilla, like you are marking 4 different mobs for crowd control or even waiting every pull for Bloodlust. Otherwise, you would be 50 minutes late to the timer. But this would incite players to go fast, so it would create this toxic environment where everyone wants to continuously rush forward, pull multiple packs of mobs, create this very chaotic experiences where you are now supposedly having to interrupt 4 different casters and dodge 6 different mechanics, or even have trouble to just target enemies to begin with because there are so many on your screen. But what if you had to entertain this question seriously? As in, what would happen, for example, if just tomorrow, if, for example, in the next patch or even the next season, we would have a death limit to the Mythic Plus season, rather than having what we already have, a timer to judge the performance in your Mythic Plus key? A lot of the possible problems have often been highlighted, right? The fact that you could have players wanting to wait for cooldowns. So, why should we just not pull every couple of minutes? Just wait for our 2-minute cooldowns or our 3-minute cooldowns every pull. So we repeat the same big, thick and large pulls we are already doing in Mythic Plus, except we can do them with all of our cooldowns. We can also, delay 2 or 3 minutes more if we can also wait for Bloodlust close to coming back. Same goes for the defensive cooldowns of the tanks. Possibly, you could also reintroduce the concept of crowd control, of course. You want to make this big pool with your big cooldowns, but, having these 4 casters come in at once might still be very dangerous, so just polymorph one. Just sheep one of them and kill it later. After all, we don't have to care too much about the timer, because it's no longer there. A lot of the players' positive points towards removing the timer would go towards the reduction of stress, right? The no longer being on a clock, on a timer, relieving a lot of stress from the Mythic Plus environment, allowing players, especially tanks, for example, to, take more time between their pulls, plan their pulls a little bit better and more safer compared to where we are now, putting, again, more focus on execution rather than speed, so being able to be rewarded more if you have a clean pool with nice crowd control or interrupts, rather than having to go faster and pulling more enemies during your Mythic Plus run. And another positive could be the meta. Right now, much of the positive traits that you want to see in a spec becoming meta is very often the damage. Simply how much damage you can do because there is a timer. For example, it's no surprise that one of the big reasons why Prot Paladin became a thing was because of their very high damage they can do compared to the other tanks. Discipline Priest is also a healer with the most damage right now in Mythic Plus, and of course, most of the times, many of the DPS becoming meta or close to being one of the meta options will also have tons of damage. So with the timer going away, you might have a shift in the meta and in what you value in a spec, for example, also towards being defensive, being tanky. Because now that you can take your time between pulls and you don't have to go that fast anymore, being able to survive or even having more utility, more crowd control to help with the packs in the key could have much higher value now. Now, whenever players try to list these pros or these cons towards not having or having a timer in your Mythic Plus key, you can pretty much choose your side and decide which one of these points you want to defend or attack, because they all have their worth. For example, the one where even if you were to remove the timer and instead have a death counter as your limit for your key, what would happen is that players would continuously grow much higher in keys until they reached a very hard cap in, for example, how much a boss can hold you there because of the damage it does. A lot of this talk, in fact all of this talk about the removal of the timer, is often because of the speed in the trash pools. However, once you meet the boss, that's the much more clear-cut limit in your key. Either you can survive the hits of a boss or you can't. Even just, for example, the first boss of Arakara that does the 2 AoEs, particularly the first AoE, eventually you will be reaching a point. Players are already doing 18s and 19s Arakara, but already at a 20 or a 21 Arakara, you are practically reaching the hard cap where that AoE will just one-shot you. You won't have enough defensives to use to be able to cover all of the phases, all of the AoE phases of that boss. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if in the rest of the key you can take 25 minutes between pulls if you simply cannot survive the boss. So what would happen definitely is that all keys will be super hard capped by simply whether or not the group can survive on a boss. This could then create a domino effect when some players could be thinking, well, if the bosses start doing too much damage, there is a simple solution. Drop a DPS and add a healer. Since the timer is not a concern, let's just run with 2 healers and 2 DPS. So we have more defensives, more externals, higher HPS. It's gonna be easier to survive. You will still be somewhat hard capped because of many bosses right now in keys having limited space in their encounter. So filling up the room with things, like for example the third boss in City of Threats. When you soak up the pools, creating the pool of black bed on the ground, eventually the entire room will be covered. The first boss in Grim Battle, creating the aftershock after you spawn the rocks on the ground, eventually the entire ground will be covered. Even the second boss of Narcotic Wake, I think, does more AoE damage after every add phase. The last boss in Stone Vault will also continuously grow more and more pools. So that's another way in which you might be capping basically your keys on bosses, because of the length it would take you to defeat those bosses. Then there is also the other point related to the timer, which is the fact that right now, even if this timer might be an issue for some players, the most run Mythic Plus keys right now are within the +7 to +10 range. So we are still talking about key levels where you are allowed to die even 20 times and still time the key. It's not a particularly competitive key level range where every death is very punishing. Multiple mistakes are allowed in that level of keys, and even if you were to remove the timer, your experience would not change that heavily. Most of the experience change without a timer would happen in the very high keys. Eventually, those kind of competitive players will be able to grow higher and higher in keys until either two things happen. Number one, you simply cannot survive past a certain boss, no matter how much you wait between pulls, or number two, you will simply stop at the point where even the smallest pull with full cooldowns and bloodlust can kill you. That would be the new hard stop. Yeah, sure, it might feel good right now to wait between pulls if you're doing a 17, but if you're waiting between pulls, you might even go all the way up to a +24. However, eventually, as you get into a +24, that's when, even with full CDs, every pull of 4 mobs only, those 4 mobs can still one-shot your tank, eventually. So even giving for granted you can actually somehow beat +24 key level bosses, that's where the new stop will be in the key. Trash mobs, even pulled one by one pack by one, still being very deadly even with cooldowns. So you would simply create a new block, a new limit, a bit higher in key level, but for the same level of result, except now Mythic Plus keys take significantly longer, which is also something we have been seeing being quite complained about by players. You know, players usually let out a big sigh whenever they see the key timer being 39 minutes, or even back in Shadowlands having some 42 minutes long timers in Mythic Plus. Many players' more favorite keys have historically been short and low duration keys, you know, keys with, 3 bosses that you can complete in 22 minutes. Those were the fan favorite in Mythic Plus rather than the 38-minute 5-boss slog, which of course would only grow longer and larger if you were to remove the timer and incentivize pulling more slowly. Every Mythic Plus key could become some 1+ hour effort every time, which would kind of go against what players have been preferring when coming to Mythic Plus duration of keys. One of the cool suggestions, one of the more neutral suggestions, honestly, for this debate was the option, whenever you put in a Mythic Plus key, to choose one of the two. So you have your keystone put in the keystone frame, and then you simply choose. Do you want to activate the timer keystone or the death limit keystone? So you actually still have the option for both. Even if this would turn into a situation where 90% of the player base still, of course, continues playing with the normal traditional version of Mythic Plus, even if you could, be the preferred version of 10% of the player base, at least you would give those 10% their favorite option. The option without a timer but with a death limit instead. That seems to be the most reasonable of the options. What is true is that definitely right now Mythic Plus keys are not designed at all to be played without a timer. Keys right now are simply too long and too big to be designed to be just taking your own time in there. They are designed to be that large and big because you try to do them fast, try to pull them quickly. If you were to somehow develop a no limit Mythic Plus key, a death limit Mythic Plus key in the next expansion, for example, all of the keys would have to go down to only having 2 bosses, maybe a couple of them having 3 bosses, and significantly lower down the level of trash required, so that if there were a timer, the key would be done in 15 minutes, and if there is no timer, you're gonna finish the key in 35 minutes, which is kind of the same time you're using now for Mythic Plus keys while trying to fight against a timer. If you just take keys balanced around doing them with a timer, so doing them very quickly, and simply just remove the timer, the average time of completing those keys would just go too high, would just become too much of a slog for many players, too much of a time commitment for just a simple key. And then of course also the rewards would be nerfed, because previously you could clear a key and get your quests and get your loot after 25 minutes of farming a quick one. Now it's gonna take you 50 minutes to clear a key for the same rewards, except you took just twice the time to complete the key. So I feel like even if we were to get this optional addition of the death limit Mythic Plus, you would still have to come with some significant adjustment to Mythic Plus itself. You cannot simply replace or take on and off like a switch the difficulty with a timer compared to the difficulty without a timer. If you were to develop a Mythic Plus meta, a Mythic Plus ecosystem around the death limit rather than the timer, then because everything is slowed down, you would have to add mechanics to trash mobs. You would have to add actual things you can do, because now you don't have to pull 15 mobs. It's pretty hard to ask of players to do mechanics similar to mechanics that you do in the raid. Like, group together, spread, soak, dodge mechanics. If you're pulling 15 mobs, you're already having a hard enough time trying to find the nameplate of the enemy you want to interrupt, for example, let alone actually doing dangerous or difficult mechanics across all of that. But if you are to slow down Mythic Plus and make you go back to pulling 4 mobs, then those 4 mobs could start having more demanding mechanics. Not just a yes, no, do it or don't mechanic like an interrupt. It could be targeting 2 players with a mark, and those players have to, go together, sort of like the first affix we had in Dragonflight, the seasonal affix, Thundering, and that was considered disastrous. That was considered very annoying because you were being busy with 15 mobs during those pulls. So doing that mechanic was considered very, very unhealthy. However, if you slow down the key, then that would be one of the things you could add in terms of mechanics. And same goes for bosses. Bosses could now have more tactically and technically dangerous mechanics to complete, while you also lower their overall damage. So you can keep growing higher in key level without simply reaching the hard cap where you get one shot because it's just too much damage, but requiring you to complete more difficult mechanics. Either way, it's not something that you could change with a switch. Oh yeah, in this new patch we will just translate the Mythic Plus timer into the death timer and continue as planned. You would also have to fundamentally change the way bosses and the way trash mobs work for that to even happen. You would have to have sort of like the balancing we have right now between PvE abilities and PvP abilities, who have different effects and different ratios of power between PvE and PvP. You would have to do the same basically for the timer version of Mythic Plus and the death limit version of Mythic Plus. However, talking about it feels kind of interesting. It would be actually kind of cool if we had the double balance of the 2 versions and you could get to test them both both. The speedy version, where you're pulling 15 enemies and the dangerous part is keeping them crowd control stunned or interrupted while you keep doing your turbo AoE DPS, and the other difficulty where you're only pulling 4 of them, but each and every one of those mobs has 3 different mechanics you have to deal with, or 3 different abilities you have to deal with, and the danger isn't simply one of the casts was uninterrupted and one of the DPS just got one shot, but something a bit more technical that you have to wrap your brain around and find a way to solve. It is definitely though an interesting take worth discussing, especially as we have been discussing in the past couple of weeks at least, the decay of interest in Mythic Plus and the more and more complaints players have had towards many of the changes put into Mythic Plus this season that has lowered the interaction and the participation of players in Mythic Plus right now. So it's worth even just getting into the talk of what changes could we see in Mythic Plus to improve the experience of players. Maybe the removal of the timer wouldn't be the correct choice, but it is worth at the very least exploring the possible alternatives we could be seeing in Mythic Plus in the near future. So, this was the point for today on this Sunday, this free talk about the possible crucial major changes to Mythic Plus and the way it operates around the goal of Mythic Plus, a timer versus a death limit. So, on the last day of this weekend, on this Sunday, we can now leave each other. We're starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, fog. That's all I wanted to communicate for today. There is just fog.